Probably the most important biological question, especially for mammals or more complex organisms, is the question of sex. Why do we have sexual dimorphism to begin with? And to understand basically the evolution of sex, one must understand the evolution of organisms in general. The first freestanding organisms that evolved from the coacervates, the very basic assortment of carbohydrates, proteins, nucleic acids, and fatty acids that existed were the essential precursors to single-celled organisms. Single-celled organisms didn't require a lot of energy in order to deal with their environment. They were very simple bundles of chemicals for all intents and purposes. They needed maybe a carbon source, maybe exposure to sunlight, and of course water. And for the most part, they were happy doing their own thing. Simple-celled organisms, for the most part, reproduced asexually. That is, they would replicate their DNA. They would actually generate additional copies of whatever structural proteins they needed, and then they would just simply divide and form two organisms where there had before only been one. One may ask, well, if single-cell organisms, our ancestors, so to speak, found it very easy to get along without having two sexes, then why is it that we develop sex? Well, a very common argument on the part of ecologists, on the part of geneticists, is this. Even though there's a great amount of efficiency in terms of energy used by single-sex, or shall we say asexual organisms, at the same time there isn't a heck of a lot in terms of genetic diversity. Mutations that accumulate over thousands of years start to accumulate within the genetic information of single-celled organisms. And without the ability to mix with another organism, that is, find some means by which the two can exchange genetic information such that you have a synergy of sorts between rather a genetic or an organism that has A, B, and C genetic mutations and another organism that has D, E, and F genetic mutations could possibly create an offspring that is relatively mutation-free. So as we see with single-cell organisms, we move up to yeast and bacteria. There are the rudimentary structures for sex. You'll find in some species of bacteria what are called pili. These are structures that allow bacteria to conjugate, that is, couple with a neighboring bacterium and exchange genetic information. This allows for such awful things, I guess, in the view of human beings, as the transference of antibiotic resistance, for example. What it involves is a, quote, male bacterium, or that bacterium that has a pilus, to exchange genetic information with an unsuspecting neighboring bacterium that lacks a pilus, and allow for the mutual exchange of genetic data. This has allowed given species of bacterium to flourish in the presence of thriving neighbors. The same also goes for yeast. So the question is, there must be something within evolution that says the energy that it takes to sustain two-sexed organisms is worth, the excess energy is worth being able to clean up your genetic information, so to speak. That is, add variation that gets rid of mutations that occur due to the environment. There are toxins within the environment, be they electromagnetic, be they chemical, etc., that will cause mutations, and there must be a way that nature allows species to first speciate, that is, differentiate one from the other, and at the same time protect themselves from horrible diseases that come with genetic mutations. So, as animals evolved, so did the structures that allowed for genetic variation, that is, genetic exchange. And so by the time we got to more intelligent animals, as we moved up into the more sophisticated phyla within the animal kingdom, so the structures of sex became more complicated. One can look at the crustaceans, one can look at insecta, and see that the sexual organs are still very, very primitive, and for the most part are not highly regulated by the central nervous system. They essentially are constantly produce germ cells, etc. Whereas as you get to more complicated organisms, even moving into aves and moving into mammalia, of course, one sees genetic organs or sexual organs that are highly controlled by the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems, and by the central nervous system in general. So now we move into the question of, okay, we have two sexes, and why do the sexes behave the way they do? Why is it that for the most part, males, and with few exceptions. I mean, there are exceptions to almost every rule in biology, but for the most part, males in every species, and particularly mammalia, seek to maximize their genetic advantage by mating with as many females as possible. And this applies to males across the board. Why is it they seek to couple with as many females as possible, whereas for the most part, females tend to be extremely selective in terms of mate? I mean, why shouldn't a female at the same time try to maximize her advantage by mating with as many males as possible? So the question then comes of natural selection. The idea is that both partners seek to find a sexual partner that will maximize their genetic potential, that the offspring will take all of the most advantageous traits of both parents and use them. One may say, well, in that case, it should imply that if one has an even distribution of all of the members of a species, then every member of one sex should want to couple with as many members of the opposite sex as is possible, and therefore have a greater probability of generating offspring that have all of the best genes within the species. But this doesn't happen. For the most part, women, or females, shall we say, tend to have a single partner within a given breeding season and generate a single offspring, or at least a single litter of offspring. And this is pretty much uniformly the case, whereas males have multiple, are guaranteed, if they are successful males within the given group or given niche in the ecosystem, tend to maximize the number of females that they are with. The philosophy is merely this. Men's biology governs that their germ cells, sperm for the most part within mammalia, are very small and actually require very much less of the body's physiological energy to produce them. They are produced for the lifetime of the male, and for the most part are easily produced and easily gotten rid of. And that is probably the intention. The intention, therefore, is also a male has an abundant source of energy. He doesn't invest a lot of his energy into his germ cells. And once he's actually coupled with a female, he has no other further biological burden, so to speak, in the actual reproductive process. The egg cell is many thousand times the size of sperm. And most mammalian females, that is, of all of the species of mammalia, have all of their eggs from the time of birth. That is, females do not produce eggs de novo once they are born. So, first of all, this number of eggs are limited on the part of all mammalian females. And since the egg is of enormous size, it also requires a lot of energy to actually invest in all of the nutrients that come into an egg, aside from the genetic information. The female also has the opportunity cost loss of once she is impregnated, she cannot mate with any others to maximize her genetic potential. Therefore, she has the load of excessive energy being involved in a very large cell, a limited number of cells, and then at the same time, pregnancy, which obviously takes you out of other possible interactions during any given breeding season. So the female thus realizes that her ability to maximize her genetic potential is limited to one shot per breeding season. Therefore, she must be extremely selective in the mate that she chooses for that given breeding season, or in more monogamous relationships among mammalians that tend to be monogamous, or among aves or birds, for the most part, which tend to have monogamous relationships, or those birds that tend to have monogamous relationships. The question of energy expenditure and the investment in young is extremely important. In aves and among mammalia, of course, there's also a lot of time devoted to raising young that have a long gestation period, that is a long time in the womb, but at the same time a long caregiving period, and this is usually put in the hands of females. Females that are caring for young or in the middle of gestation can't, therefore, produce other young. Whereas males, on the other hand, have absolutely no obligation, less energy expenditure, a greater and almost seemingly inexhaustible number of germ cells, therefore can find their best advantage in, shall we say, being promiscuous. So the biological reasons behind sex point to, first, the need for genetic variation and the need to have two sexes to just protect the integrity of the genetic information within a given species. And then once that species has differentiated into very complex sexual organs and complex sexual behaviors, that the two sexes run in opposition to each other. That is, it makes sense that in excess genetic variation, excess mixing, shall we say, is also disadvantageous merely because of the chemical events that allow for mixing of DNA, so to speak, have a limit. There's a limit of advantage, wherein too much mixing is as deleterious as having an external mutagen or external cause for mutation, whereas too little is also a great disadvantage. So one means of creating a happy medium is to have one party in the genetic variative scheme be particularly the most mobile variable, and the other one to be a more stable variable. And in that case, the female has tended to be the stable, and the male to be, shall we say, the more variable of the two of them. Therefore, we can see that with the differentiation of organs and the differentiation of sexual behavior, sex, as it is seen in the world of nature, has a biological basis that goes a long way to explaining the behaviors of all animals, including man.